Welcome to this mini lecture on Care for Time, Part 1. Care for Time, and of course the practice of graceful presence in Care for Time is hope. And we might define that right now as the confident expectation in the goodness of life and the purpose and value in your life. And in Care for Time, what we're dealing with is our relationship to time, our relationship to those passage of events between our birth and our death. It's our relationship to those passage of events in time between our waking and our sleeping. It has been said that waking up in the morning is the most profound of philosophical acts. It says that you have the courage to get up and to live your life. It has also been said that going to sleep at night, going to bed at night, is the most profound religious act. It says you have the faith that you'll wake up in the morning. In any case, to care for time is to cultivate graceful presence to those events of the in-between, in between waking, sleeping, birth, and death. And we'll be working towards this idea of cultivating hope. In this first part of the lecture, Part 1 will be setting up this discussion, and in Part 2 we'll focus more specifically on hope. But to constantly have this expectation in the goodness of life and in the purpose and value of your life is not easy. It can be difficult. There's a fancy word that describes the opposite of hope. There's a fancy word for the condition of despair, of hopelessness, and it is nihilism. Nihilism literally means nothingness. Whenever you feel like there is no point, no purpose, no reason for life or for your life, when you feel there's no reason for anything, you're experiencing nihilism, the threat of nothingness. And I'm sure we've all experienced from time to time the fleeting appearance of nihilism. For some, it seems to stick around a lot longer. There's a famous story from ancient Greece about the wisest man, then known, named Silenus. One day, Silenus was captured by King Midas. And King Midas, figuring that he had with him, the supposedly wisest person around, decided to ask him who the happiest person was. And Silenus's famous answer was, the best thing for man, he said, is not to be born, and if already born, to die as soon as possible. Wow, that's the attitude of nihilism. Maybe you've experienced that before. Now, two major causes of the despair of nihilism, the enemy of hope, are boredom and death. Boredom can trigger feelings of insignificance, that my life has no purpose, no value. With boredom, you lose interest in your surroundings. It's the refusal to care. Boredom is a refusal to participate in life. You reject the joy of participation, of the joy of existence. You don't want to do anything. Maybe some of you have been experiencing this now, these last few weeks, cut off from your normal schedule of activities. It's easy to fall victim to this feeling of boredom. Now, boredom is not the same as having nothing to do, and you certainly don't want to fight boredom with just busyness. Boredom is the feeling of refusing to care about anything. Having nothing to do can be a joyful experience if you use it to simply be present to life in the moment. But boredom, again, is the enemy of care. It's a refusal to care, the rejection of the joyful participation in life. Death, of course, can be the other enemy of hope. The tragic death of those we love can trigger thoughts of the cruelty and absurdity of life, feeling that life is not good, that we're born just to die, so what's the point? I remember a family many years ago, back in graduate school. The family was just like mine. There was a husband and wife with 2 children. The first year of graduate school, I remember the young husband unexpectedly dies of a stroke one day while walking across campus, leaving his wife a widow and his young daughters fatherless. This was tragic and heart-wrenching. I remember his funeral and the sadness experienced there. 1 year after his death, the woman, his widow, and her 2 children moved into our 20-story apartment building in Cambridge. They moved into the 19th floor. We ourselves lived on the 18th floor, right underneath them. I remember helping this woman and her 2 daughters move into their new apartment and get settled in. After we had done this, it was evening. We went back to our apartment on the 18th floor to relax. Not long after we got there, I remember hearing the most horrible, horrible scream, a sound like I've never heard before or since. We stopped what we were doing and listened, but we couldn't hear anything else. Soon there was a knock at our door, however, and we received the news of what had happened and the explanation for the scream. Apparently, one of the young daughters of this woman was sitting on the windowsill right before bed and leaned back. The screen popped out, and this young girl fell 19 stories to her death. The scream we had heard was her mother screaming as she ran down 19 steps of floors to find the dead body of her daughter. I remember rushing to the hospital, and I'll never forget the experience of seeing this young mother in a small room with the body of her daughter. The pain on her face, the uncontrollable grief visible in her body was indescribable. What do you say? What can you say about hope when faced with this scope of tragedy of death? So boredom and death can rob us of hope. Instead of caring for time, we're just doing time. However, in caring for time in our passage of events between waking and sleeping, birth and death, we'll all experience the demon of boredom and the tragedy of death. So the question is, how do we respond in a way to preserve and save hope, to cultivate hope, even in the face of horrible boredom and terrible death? Because responding in the right way to boredom and death can be beneficial. Responding in the right way to boredom can awaken you to your own unique responsibility for your own life. And the presence of death can often open your eyes to what really matters in life, so you can stop wasting your time on what matters least. So the presence of death, right, if responded to with hope, can help you live a more profound life of graceful presence. Now this brings us to the 2 great modern philosophers to introduce here, Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, and Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher. We want to use these 2 philosophers and their very different ideas to think through the problem of boredom and death and the appropriate response to nihilism. They both will say that the main cause of the pandemic of modern nihilism, or loss of hope today, is the death of God. They both recognize the declining relevance of God and religion in modern society. Kierkegaard saw that even those who professed faith and went to church were not taking God seriously. They espoused faith in God and religion, but their lived faith was in comfort and convenience and making money. They would go to church on Sunday, but then exploit their neighbors Monday through Saturday. They would read the Bible, but then oppress the poor. Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw that science was replacing God and business was replacing religion in modern life. There is an interesting story about a French astronomer named Laplace who wrote a textbook on the universe, on astronomy. It was the very first textbook written that did not mention God. Napoleon, apparently, the anecdotal story says that Napoleon asked him why there was no mention of God in his textbook on science, on the universe. And Laplace's famous answer was, "We no longer have need of that hypothesis. Science could now explain things independently of any, assumed presumption of God's existence." Now, think about that for a moment, right? What Nietzsche is saying, how science was replacing God and religion in a way, right? Before the 19th century, if you were sick, you would go see a priest, perhaps. Now, of course, if you're sick, you go to a doctor. Before the 19th century, if you were hungry, you would probably pray for a better harvest. Today, if you're hungry, you get a better job or perhaps, go to the government for welfare. Before the 19th century, if you were seeking answers, you would turn to the Bible. Now, if you're seeking answers, you would turn to science, though many of you would say Google as opposed to science. And also, if before the 19th century, if you were seeking security, you would go to church. Now, if you're seeking security, you might buy some stocks and bonds or buy insurance. Funny story, Gandhi once described insurance as a vote of no confidence in God. In any case, they both forecast, that is Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, both forecast the declining relevance of God and religion in modern culture. But they did feel differently about it. For Kierkegaard, the absence of God from modern life was a tragedy that could only end in the hopelessness of nihilism. Kierkegaard wanted to reintroduce Christ to Christians, he famously said. He wanted to reinvigorate a genuine religious feeling. And the ideal that he presented to his fellow Danish citizens was the ideal of the knight of faith. And the knight of faith was the person who lives with great inner depth in the midst of ordinary life, who can discover great truth in the most banal of circumstances, who in modest domestic life can find paradise. The knight of faith is a person who joyfully lives in time, but with an eye always on eternity, who passionately engages this life in all difficulties, but always from the perspective of eternity. And it is that knight of faith who can live with hope, regardless of the boredom or death that haunts modern life. We'll be looking more at Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith in the next lecture. Nietzsche, of course, he saw the death of God as a positive evolutionary step that freed us from a type of slave morality that led us to reject this life in hopes for a better afterlife. But for Nietzsche, this is the only life we get. There is only this life, this earth. So to reject what is for what will never be, he thought would be a foolish sacrifice. For Nietzsche, with the death of God, now we have the challenge of becoming gods ourselves. His ideal was what he called the Übermensch, sometimes translated as a Superman, hence the funny picture there. But the Übermensch is the ideal of the person who is complete master of her, his own body, emotions, thoughts, and actions. He or she alone is responsible, not God, not one's parents, not one's religious leaders, right? But only you. The Übermensch is devoted to this life and this earth because it's all there is. This is the only one you get, so dare to live it to the fullest and on your own terms. Again, we'll be looking in the next lecture a bit more at Nietzsche's Übermensch and how the Übermensch can cultivate hope in the face of boredom and death. I'm going to end this part 1 here, and in part 2 we'll talk more specifically about how Kierkegaard and Nietzsche suggest we might cultivate hope, and then we'll look at Viktor Frankl, the great Austrian psychiatrist, and we'll end on his program, his 3 activities that we can do to cultivate and live with hope in each moment. The quiz access code for this quiz is 1963. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.